The road came down out of the high country, the way all mountain roads come down in long, reluctant curves, as if the mountain itself was not quite ready to let go of what passed through it. Keller Mountain Road dropped 1,400 feet in 11 miles, switching back through stands of ponderosa pine and exposed granite shelves that caught the last of the afternoon light and held it amber and long against the rock face. It was the kind of road that demanded attention and rewarded it. A road that reminded a man he was small and the world was large, and that the distance between those two facts was the only space worth living in. Dax Mercer had ridden this road 200 times. He knew every curve by the way it felt in his hands, every elevation change by the shift in air temperature against his face. He knew the place at mile 7 where the road widened briefly at an old pullout, and you could see on clear evenings all the way to the Callahan Valley floor 30 miles east. He knew the place at mile 4 where the rail bridge crossed above the junction with Route 9, throwing its shadow across the road in a band of darkness, even on bright afternoons. He knew this road the way a man knows a thing he has traveled through enough times that it has become part of his internal geography, part of the map he carries that has nothing to do with paper or screens. He was riding point as he always rode at the front of the column where the road captain belonged. Behind him in the staggered formation that 11 years of riding together had made second nature came 11 more bikes, the steel saw chapter of the Hells Angels. Keller County, Nevada. 12 men, 12 machines moving through the mountain afternoon with the particular coherence of an organism that has learned to think as one. Each rider reading the one ahead. Each bike positioned to give sight lines and reaction time. The column moved like water, finding its way downhill, not fast, not slow, but with the unhurried certainty of something that knows where it is going and has no reason to rush. Dax Mercer was 44 years old and built like the kind of man the mountains make. Not bulky, but dense with the specific leanness of someone who had spent the better part of his adult life doing things that required his body to be an instrument rather than a monument. 6'2", 190 pounds that had never once been decorative. His face had the weathered quality of sustained outdoor exposure and the particular stillness of a man who has learned that expression is a resource and that resources get conserved. There was a scar along his left jawline, thin and white, and old enough to have lost its story for anyone who didn't already know it. He had stopped explaining it years ago. The people who needed to know already did. On the back of his cut in the position that meant something to everyone who understood what it meant, and nothing to everyone who didn't, Road Captain Steel Saw Chapter. Below that, the bottom rocker, Nevada. He had worn this cut for 11 years. Before the cut, he had worn a different uniform in different terrain under different orders. 12 years of Army Rangers, 3 combat deployments. The kind of service record that gets classified at certain points and summarized at others, and never quite fits on the forms that ask you to explain what you did and why. He had come home from the last deployment with all his limbs and most of his certainties, and he had spent the following year figuring out which certainties were worth keeping and which ones were weight he no longer needed to carry. The Steel Saw chapter had found him, or he had found it, in the way that certain things find each other, not by accident exactly, but not by plan either. By the specific gravity of compatibility. These were men who understood silence and formation and the particular bond that forms between people who have decided to trust each other with their lives and have found the decision was correct. Garrett Holt, the chapter president, had shaken his hand at a rally outside Reno 17 years ago and said 4 words that had mattered: you ride like you think. It had been enough. The afternoon was cooling fast, the way high desert afternoons cool abruptly without negotiation, the temperature dropping 10 degrees in the time it takes to descend 1,000 feet of elevation. Dax could feel it in the air against the backs of his hands, that cold, carrying the smell of pine resin and granite dust, and the particular cleanness of air that hasn't been near a city in a long time. He was thinking about nothing in particular, which was the state he preferred on long rides, a kind of operational alertness without a specific object, attention spread wide and shallow, ready for whatever the road decided to present. The road decided to present a sound. He heard it before he understood what it was. A thin, high presence in the air behind, and to his right, not mechanical, not animal, not the mountain. Something that didn't belong to the inventory of sounds this road normally contained. He checked his right mirror on instinct, the kind of check that happens before the conscious mind has formulated a question and saw it. A bicycle. Small old, the chrome of its handlebars gone to rust, and the fenders rattling with the vibration of a dirt shoulder at speed. And on it, standing up on the pedals, pumping with everything he had, a boy. Maybe 9 years old, maybe 10. Dark hair plastered flat with sweat against a forehead tilted upward toward Dax's mirror, and a mouth that was open and clearly screaming something that the wind and the engine noise and the physics of the situation were reducing to nothing by the time it reached him. Dax hit his brake. Not a panic stop, not a skid. The controlled, deliberate deceleration of a man who has spent 11 years leading columns of motorcycles and knows exactly how to communicate urgency through his brake light without communicating chaos. Behind him, 11 sets of brakes answered. The column slowed in the synchronized, staggered sequence of men who have done this enough times that their reactions have merged into a single reflex. 12 bikes settled to a standstill on the shoulder of Keller Mountain Road with the patient rumble of engines holding it idle. Silence relative. The boy coasted the last 30 yards, still standing on the pedals, and dropped his bike in the gravel and kept running until he was 4 feet from Dax's front wheel, where he stopped with his hands on his knees and his head down, pulling air in the ragged, desperate way of someone who has been going as hard as they can go for longer than their body wanted to sustain. Dax shut his engine off. He swung off the bike and stood there and looked at the boy, who was still bent over, still fighting for breath, still not looking up. Behind him, he heard 11 engines go quiet one by one, the last one dying just as the mountain wind came through the pines above them and filled the silence with its own sound. The boy was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans with holes in both knees and one sneaker with a broken lace that had been knotted twice and was holding anyway. The bicycle that had deposited him here was a rust-eaten thing clearly sized for a child 3 years younger. The seat adjusted as high as it would go and still not quite right. The boy had been riding it anyway, standing on the pedals the whole way, which is how you ride a bike that's too small for you when the situation doesn't give you the option of waiting for the right equipment. Dax crouched down to eye level. He had done this specific thing, crouched to a child's eye level, exactly once before, on a street in a city he didn't name, in conversations kneeling next to a boy of about the same age who had been trying to tell him something important in a language he didn't speak. That boy had been right about what he was trying to say. Dax had learned that day that the information children carry is often more accurate than the information adults carry, because children haven't yet learned the art of managing the truth for an audience. He waited. The boy took a breath, a real one, the first one that went all the way down. He raised his head and looked at Dax, and the look was a combination Dax had learned to recognize in people who have seen something real and are fighting hard against the reasonable fear that they won't be believed, terrified and certain at the same time. The look of someone who has made a decision and is past the point of reconsidering it. "Take your time," Dax said. The boy took one more breath. "They're waiting for you around the corner," he said. "Men with guns. At the bridge. They're going to kill you." His name was Cal Britton. He lived 2.5 blocks off Keller Mountain Road in a house that sat at the end of a gravel driveway and needed a new porch step and exterior paint and several other things that get deferred when money is the way money sometimes is. His mother worked at the county medical center in Ridgeline, the nearest town of any size doing the kind of nursing work that happens in the hours when most people are asleep. The bicycle, which was technically his cousin's and which Cal had inherited 18 months ago when his cousin graduated to something larger, was the thing he used to get anywhere that mattered to him. What mattered to him this particular afternoon was the Harwick Mill building off Route 9. The Harwick Mill was a long, low concrete industrial structure that had stopped being a mill 11 years ago and had been promised demolition by the county for most of the time, since without anyone getting around to it. It had 3 floors of empty space and broken windows, and the specific ecology of an abandoned building in the high desert, dry rot and pack rat nests, and in the back corner of the 3rd floor, behind a collapsed shelving unit, that created a natural windbreak, a reliably productive hunting ground for Cicindela oregona, the Oregon tiger beetle, whose iridescent green-bronze carapace Cal had been collecting and cataloging since the previous spring. He had been flat on his stomach in that corner mason jar open beside him when the voices came up from the loading bay. 2 floors below, the loading bay doors, which no longer had doors open onto the back of the building, away from Route 9, which was why Cal had not seen the vehicles when he arrived. The voices came up through the gaps in the concrete flooring, old industrial construction hollow, in places sound traveling through it, the way sound travels through old buildings selectively in channels that make no obvious architectural sense. The voices were low, deliberate, the voices of men who were being careful not to carry. Cal had stayed flat because something in those voices told him that was the correct thing to do. He did not examine this instinct. He acted on it. He put the lid on the mason jar, and he lay still, and he listened for 20 minutes. And what he heard over those 20 minutes assembled itself in his mind with the clarity that comes to people who are paying the kind of attention that fear produces. 3 vehicles, black, no plates, parked in the loading bay and around the side of the building. He couldn't see them, but he heard doors, and he heard the sound of equipment being handled, metallic, heavy, purposeful. He heard the number 14 spoken in the context of a head count. He heard the word strip spoken in a context that suggested something placed on a road. He heard the words automatic and drums and load up used together by a voice that was giving instructions in the flat. Even tone of someone accustomed to giving instructions that get followed. He heard the bridge, the rail bridge, corner of Route 9 and Keller Mountain Road. He heard the word convoy, and then he heard the name, not once, 3 times from 2 different voices in 2 different contexts, used the way you use a name when it's an authority you're referencing rather than a person you're talking to. Mayor Vale said, "Mayor Vale's instructions. Do it the way Mayor Vale wants it done." Cal reached into his jeans pocket and found the stub of pencil he always carried, the same pocket where he kept a folded piece of notebook paper for field notes on specimens. He pulled both out. He lay flat, and he wrote in the careful block letters he used for specimen documentation, the letters his 3rd-grade teacher had told him were the clearest printing she had ever seen from a student his age, and he wrote everything he had heard. Not impressions, not summaries. The actual words, as close as he could reproduce them, with the name beside each fragment that contained it, and the number 3 with a circle around it beside the name Mayor Vale, because he had heard it 3 times, and 3 times seemed important. He waited until the voices stopped and the vehicle sounds indicated departure, and then he waited 5 more minutes because 5 minutes was what you did when you needed to be sure. Then he got up, went down the stairs on the east side of the building that he had never used before but which were there and were concrete, and held his weight across the scrubland behind the building to where he had left his bike against a fence post and rode. Not toward home, not toward the county medical center where his mother was working, toward the mountain road, because the mountain road was where the convoy was coming, and the mountain road was where the bridge was, and the mountain road was where the men with the guns were going to be. And because Cal Britton had decided somewhere on the stairs of the Harwick Mill building that he was going to get there first. He had been scared. He was still scared. The fear was present and specific, and he did not pretend it wasn't there. He just rode anyway. Now he stood 4 feet from the front wheel of Dax Mercer's motorcycle, having ridden 20 minutes as hard as he had ever ridden anything. And he looked at a man who crouched at eye level and waited without impatience, and listened with his full attention, and Cal reached into his pocket and unfolded the piece of notebook paper and held it out. "I wrote it down," he said. "Everything I heard. I wrote it down right away so I wouldn't get it wrong." Dax took the paper. He read it without expression, which was how he read everything that required a response rather than a reaction. He read it once and then he read it again, and the second reading was slower. And when he was done, he folded the paper carefully along its original creases and put it in the interior pocket of his, cut in the same place he put things he needed to be certain of keeping. He stood up. He turned and looked at his 11 brothers, all still on their bikes, all watching him with the alertness that men develop when they have ridden together long enough to know that when Dax Mercer went quiet and still something was being calculated, and the calculation would be thorough, and the result would be worth waiting for. Cutter, he said. Cutter Voss was the second man in the column, compact and broad-shouldered, with a military bearing that came from the same source as Dax's and expressed itself in the same way, not in posture exactly, but in the readiness that posture communicates. He had been with the chapter 9 years, and with Dax specifically for 7 of those years, in the capacity of the man you put closest to the road captain, because you trust him to read the same information the road captain is reading and arrive at the same conclusions without being told. Get the drone up, Dax said. Route 9 Junction Rail Bridge corner. Full thermal. Cutter was already off his bike. Dax looked back at Cal. He looked at the bruise on the boy's left shoulder, visible where the t-shirt had shifted during the long sprint. It was the color of something done deliberately and recently deep red at the edges. Still the body's inflammation response still working at full capacity, which meant hours rather than days. He did not ask about it. He noted it the way he noted things that would require attention at the appropriate time, which was not this moment. You rode out here to warn us, he said. Yes, sir. On that bike. Cal looked at the bicycle lying in the gravel. Yes, sir. How long did that take you? Cal considered this with the seriousness of a child who understands that precision matters. About 20 minutes. I was going as fast as I could. Dax looked at the bicycle. He looked at the broken lace, nodded twice. He thought about a 9-year-old boy lying flat on a concrete floor, listening to men plan a killing, and then making a decision alone, and then getting on a bike that was 3 years too small for him, and riding 20 minutes on a mountain road shoulder to deliver the information to the people it concerned, because it was the right thing to do, and there was no one else to do it. You did good, Dax said. He said it simply without decoration, the way he said everything that he meant completely. The drone was a modified DJI Matric, the thermal overlay package added by a chapter member who had spent 8 years doing aerial reconnaissance work for a defense contractor before deciding he preferred the company of the Steel Saw chapter to the company of defense contractors. It lived in a hard case in Dax's right saddlebag and had been there for 4 years, and in 4 years exactly 2 people had asked what it was doing there, and both of them had stopped asking after Dax looked at them. Cutter had it in the air in 58 seconds. The feed came through to Dax's phone 30 seconds after that. The corner of Route 9 and Keller Mountain Road, seen from 40 feet up in the amber-tinted thermal wash, looked exactly like what it was. A kill zone. 3 SUVs, black. No plates, the thermal signatures of their engines showing as dim orange shapes still cooling from recent arrival, were positioned in a staggered formation under the rail bridge. Military stagger. The positioning that accounts for blast radius and crossfire lanes and the specific geometry of trapping moving targets in a confined space. Whoever had set this up had thought about it the way people think about it when they have done it before. The spike strips were laid in 2 lines. One at the entry to the junction where a motorcycle's front wheel would hit it at speed before the rider had time to react. A second line 15 yards further in past the point where even a rider who felt the first strip and reacted could stop before hitting the second. The 2-stage design. Not improvised, not intuitive. The doctrine of someone who understood that the goal of a spike strip deployment is not to slow the target, but to ensure the target cannot exit the kill zone under their own power. 14 thermal signatures were distributed between the vehicles in the bridge. Dax counted them twice the way he had been trained to count things that mattered not once for the information, but twice for the confirmation. 2 elevated. 1 on the bridge structure itself, prone rifle-oriented toward the approach road. 1 on the concrete abutment to the south, providing angular coverage of the junction entry. The remaining 12 were ground level, split between the north and south flanks, in a disposition designed to close from both sides once the spike strips accomplished their first purpose. And in the center, moving between the vehicles with the unhurried confidence of a man who has set up this kind of operation before and trusts his setup one figure that moved differently from the others. Not checking, not watching the road, monitoring. Hands moving occasionally to a communications device at his chest. running the thing from the inside the way people run things when they trust the preparation and are managing the execution. Rylan Teal. Dax didn't know the name yet. He knew the posture. He rotated the drone north, surveying the terrain above the junction. The hillside rose steeply behind the rail bridge, pine and scrub juniper, on a gradient that was steep but manageable, accessible from the service trail that ran along the rail line 100 feet above the road. Dax had ridden past the service trail access point 200 times. He had never looked at it from this angle. He looked at it now. He studied the feed for 90 seconds. He looked at the elevated positions, the ground dispositions, the sight lines created by the bridge pillars, the shadow coverage available on the north slope above the overwatch position on the bridge. He looked at the service trail. He looked at the distance between the trail and the bridge overwatch. 15 feet of controlled drop from the ridge edge to the bridge surface. Manageable. Then the calculation that the thermal feed had been building toward completed itself. 2-stage spike strips, staggered vehicles in fire suppression formation, overwatch coverage of the approach road from 2 elevated angles, ground elements disposed for bilateral flanking closure. This was not a robbery attempt. This was not a message. This was a designed kill operation built by someone who knew how kill operations worked, intended to produce a specific outcome. 12 motorcycles entering a junction and none of them leaving. Dax looked at the piece of paper in his pocket. He thought about Mayor Conrad Vale in his office somewhere in Ridgeline. He thought about the name written 3 times in the block letters of a 9-year-old who understood that accuracy was the most important thing he could offer. He thought about what questions you would have to be asking and what answers you would have to be getting close to for a man in Vale's position to decide that 14 armed men in a prepared kill zone was a proportionate response. He turned and faced his 11 brothers. The overwatch positions first, he said, simultaneously before they can signal each other. Then the flanks. We have terrain and surprise. We use both completely. He looked at Cutter. I need you with Cal. Side roads back to the clubhouse. Not the main road. Make sure he's inside before you come back. He looked at the column. He looked at Kelso, the chapter's youngest road member, 26 years old, and 3 years in position 7th in the column, whose particular combination of speed and reliability on a bike had made him useful for things that required someone to cover ground quickly and quietly. Kelso, Aldrin Field. You know where it is. Kelso nodded. Private strip, 40 miles east. Get out there now. Talk to the owner. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. That strip doesn't operate tonight. Kelso was already turning his bike. Dax looked at the remaining 9 men. He mapped the plan out in 3 minutes flat. The service trail access point 600 yards back. The slope gradient and tree coverage. The positions relative to the overwatch men on the bridge and the abutment. The timing that would put the high elements and the ground elements in contact simultaneously. He assigned each man a position and a target and a signal. He was precise. He did not waste words. The men listened the way men listen when they trust the source of the information and understand the stakes of the application. Nobody fires unless I give the word, he said. We're not here to kill anyone. We're here to end this and find out exactly who built it and who paid for it. He looked at the junction shadow on the drone feed. He looked at the man moving between the vehicles in the center, confident, unhurried, running a kill zone that was about to become something else entirely. The center man stays intact and talking, he said. That's the priority after the overwatch goes. He picked up his bike. He looked back once at Cal Britton standing beside his rust-eaten bicycle in the gravel of Keller Mountain Road, watching with the expression of a boy who has done what he came to do and is now reckoning with the fact that the doing of it has brought him to a place he didn't entirely anticipate. Dax held the boy's gaze for a moment. You were right to come, he said. That took nerve. Cal looked at him. Something in the boy's face shifted, not relief exactly, but the specific release of a tension that had been held since the moment he made his decision on those stairs. The tension of someone who has bet everything on being believed and has found that the bet was sound. Cutter appeared at the boy's side key, already in hand, guiding Cal toward his own machine. Dax watched for 1 second more long enough to see the boy go without hesitation, long enough to confirm what he already knew about the nerve Cal Britton carried. Then he turned back to the mountain. The service trail was a single lane of packed gravel running along the old rail bed above the junction, accessible from a dirt turnout 600 yards back up the mountain road, marked by nothing except a rusted gate that hadn't been locked in 15 years. The trail was not designed for 9 men moving in single file through high desert scrub in the declining light of a late afternoon that was becoming evening faster than the mountain had any obligation to announce. It was accessible, and it put them on the ridge directly above the rail bridge, overwatch position in 17 minutes of careful movement. Dax counted the time. The ambush team below was still in position, still waiting. The thermal signatures on the drone feed that Cutter had left running on return autopilot were patient and undisturbed, their confidence in the completeness of their setup entirely intact. That confidence was about to be revised. The man on the bridge was prone on the concrete surface, 15 feet below the ridgeline, his rifle oriented toward the empty approach road where 12 motorcycles were supposed to appear and where they were not now going to appear. He was wearing body armor and a communications headset. He was focused on the direction the threat was supposed to come from, which is the fundamental vulnerability of any Overwatch position. It requires you to commit to an orientation. And commitment to an orientation means the unmonitored angles are behind you. Dax went over the ridge edge without a sound. 15 feet in a controlled drop, angled to land behind the man's right shoulder, outside his peripheral vision, his boots hitting the concrete in a roll that distributed the impact and killed the noise of it. What followed was not a fight. It was a sequence, the specific series of joint manipulations and pressure applications that the Army had taught him to accomplish in 3 to 4 seconds, and that 11 years of ensuring he hadn't forgotten had kept available without rust. The man's radio hand went first, then his weapon hand, then he was face down on the bridge surface, zip-tied at the wrist with a cable tie from Dax's jacket pocket, with Dax's knee in the center of his back, and Dax's hands removing the communications headset with the careful efficiency of someone extracting something valuable. Dax put the headset on. He heard Ryland Teal's voice. Calm professional running a position check through the circuit with the flat authority of a man who is accustomed to receiving prompt responses and has no reason to expect otherwise. Dax said nothing. He waited and he listened, and what he heard in the 30 seconds of listening before the world below the bridge began to change told him several things. Teal's voice had the particular steadiness of operational experience, not excitement, not nerves, not the performed calm of someone managing their own fear. Actual calm. The calm of a man who has done this kind of work before in operational settings, and for whom this evening was a professional engagement rather than an exceptional circumstance. He heard something else. Teal wasn't just running the position check. He was on a second channel, the check was for his team, but underneath it, in the pauses, in the slight shift in register, when Teal turned towards something to his left, there was communication with a different listener. Not frequent, not detailed, but present, consistent. Someone was monitoring this operation from elsewhere. Teal was keeping them informed in real time. Dax filed that information and held the bridge and waited for the signal. Below, his brothers moved. They did not come loudly, not like a brawl. Like a closing the way a hand closes around something it has already decided to hold. Fingers finding their positions without urgency because the decision was made before the motion began. The flanking figures went first, isolating the men at the outer positions before those men could become mutual support for each other. The south abutment overwatch went at the same moment Dax went for the bridge, timed by the hand signal Dax had given from the ridge, a downward cut of the right hand visible to the man positioned on the trail above, with line of sight to both who related in both directions simultaneously. 2 seconds of coordinated movement that removed the elevated coverage from the kill zone before the ground elements below had processed that anything had changed. Then the ground elements. The men at the outer flanks went quietly, the way outer flanks go when they have been isolated before they can signal each other one moment, present and operational the next moment, face down in the gravel with zip ties at their wrists and a knee in their back, and a hand removing their radio. The men in the center near the SUVs had slightly more warning enough to register that something was wrong, not enough to do anything organized about it. By the time the first one reached for his weapon in a way that was purposeful rather than reflexive, there were three members of the Steel Saw chapter between him and any useful action, and the distance closed before the action completed. It was not clean in the way that plans are clean. It was clean in the way that prepared people moving in coordination are clean messier than diagrams, faster than resistance, could organize itself finished before the other side had time to find the word for what was happening to them. Ryland Teal was the last one standing, literally. In the center of the junction between the two SUVs where he had been running the operation, from the position of authority and oversight, the position of the man who had built this and trusted it and was watching it be executed. He had the satellite phone in his left hand, and his right hand was moving toward the weapon at his hip when he became aware, with the awareness of a professionally experienced man, that the weapon at his hip was no longer there. Someone had removed it during the movement that he had been 3 seconds too slow to respond to, and that 3 seconds was the entire margin between the situation he had built and the situation he was now in. He stood in the center of his kill zone and looked at what his kill zone had become. 13 men seated against the tires of the three SUVs, zip-tied at the wrists, weapons on the road in a line 6 feet to his left. The spike strip still in position across the road, no longer useful to anyone. The bridge above him empty of the overwatch position that was supposed to make this a contained operation. 9 men in steel saw cuts standing at the edges of the junction with the patient, unhurried posture of people who have finished the active portion of an evening and are now in the administrative phase. Teal looked at all of it. He was 43 years old, and his face had the weathering of someone who had spent a significant portion of his adult life outdoors in conditions that were not recreational. He had a contractor's bearing, not military exactly, but shaped by it the way clay is shaped by a mold, even after you remove the mold. He understood what had happened with the comprehensive clarity of a professional who has been outmaneuvered and knows it, and is not going to waste anyone's time pretending otherwise. Dax walked toward him from the bridge end of the junction. The phone, Dax said. Teal looked at him for a moment with the evaluating look of a man taking a final measurement of something. Then he held the satellite phone out. Dax took it. Military-grade encryption, the kind of hardware that gets sourced through channels that don't show up in retail records. The kind that has deletion protocols that can wipe everything in 4 seconds if you know the sequence. The code, Dax said. Teal said nothing for 3 seconds. Then one of the chapter members who had positioned himself at Teal's right shoulder applied a very specific pressure to the junction of Teal's left shoulder and neck. The kind of pressure that is not violent in the conventional sense, but that produces in the nerve cluster, it targets an immediate and comprehensive sensation that clarifies the cost-benefit analysis of silence considerably. Teal gave him the code. The phone opened. The message thread was at the top of the communication history undeleted because Teal had not expected to need to delete it tonight. Had not expected tonight to produce a situation in which deletion would be the relevant priority. The thread was not long. It was not ambiguous. It was the operational terseness of instructions passed between a person giving orders and a person receiving them. Stripped of context because context was assumed. Stripped of explanation because explanation was unnecessary, containing only what was required for execution. Wait for the convoy at the Route 9 junction. Rail bridge. Use the strips both lanes, 14 men minimum. Leave no survivors. Stage the scene rival gang, make it look territorial. Bikes disappear. No trace of chapter connection to the county. Payment on confirmation of completion. And at the bottom of the thread, the sender information routed through 2 relay points that Dax worked through on the spot following the verification chain with the methodical patience of someone who has done this kind of trace work before and knows that the chain always leads somewhere if you follow it far enough. It led to a city government communications account. The account was registered to the office of Mayor Conrad Vale, Ridgeline, Nevada. Dax read the thread twice. He photographed it with his own phone from 4 angles, making sure each photograph captured the sender information and timestamp and message content in a single frame that could not be argued to be partial or selectively cropped. He forwarded the photographs to 3 separate encrypted destinations, one to Garrett Holt, one to a number he had maintained for 18 months for exactly the category of situation in which you need a record to exist somewhere that is not on your person, and one to a third destination that he did not name aloud. Then he looked at Teal. "You're going to sit here," he said, "until the people I just sent this to arrive. That's going to take a few hours." He looked at the 13 men along the SUVs. "All of you are." He picked up the satellite phone and looked at it for one moment. The weight of it, the particular heaviness of a device that had been the operational center of an evening that was supposed to end very differently, and put it in the inner pocket of his cut beside the notebook paper with Cal Britton's careful block letters. He walked back up to the ridge. He called Garrett. Garrett Holt had been the Steel Saw chapter's president for 16 years, and in those 16 years, he had received a significant variety of phone calls from Dax Mercer, ranging from the routine to the significant. He understood from the texture of Dax's voice at the beginning of a call, not what was said, but the density of the silence before the first word, roughly where on that spectrum any given call was going to land. This call landed at the far end. Garrett listened without interrupting. He was 53 years old with silver hair worn back from a face that had accumulated the weathering of a man who had spent 5 decades outdoors and had never spent much time worrying about what that did to his appearance. He was not a man who raised his voice. He had found over 16 years of chapter leadership that the quieter he was, the more clearly people heard him, and that the things worth saying were worth saying at a volume that required people to pay attention. When Dax finished, Garrett was quiet for 4 seconds. "How solid is the phone evidence?" he said. "Timestamp," Dax said. "Sender verified to Vale's city account. Photographed from 4 angles. Already distributed." Another 2 seconds of quiet. The boy Garrett said, "Safe. Cutter has him. Clubhouse side roads." Garrett said nothing for a moment. "Then I'll let you know if anything changes here." He ended the call and sat for a moment in the chair behind his desk in the clubhouse office, a room that was functional rather than decorative, with a whiteboard on one wall and a county road map on another, and a filing cabinet that contained the kind of documentation that chapter presidents accumulate over 16 years of managing the intersection between a motorcycle club and the world the motorcycle club exists inside. He thought about what Dax had told him. He thought about a 9-year-old boy on a rust-eaten bicycle. He thought about Mayor Conrad Vale, whom he had met twice at county functions in the past 3 years, each time in the context of the city's ongoing effort to reclassify the industrial corridor on the east end of Ridgeline, a reclassification that would have had it gone through significantly increased the property tax basis of 6 parcels that the Steel Saw chapter owned outright, and 3 more that chapter members owned individually. The reclassification had not gone through. Garrett had always understood that the reason it hadn't gone through was that 3 county commissioners had looked at the proposal and found it inconsistent with existing zoning doctrine. He was now revising that understanding in light of new information. He picked up his phone and sent a single text to the chapter's emergency frequency contact list. "Not the furnace bell. Not yet. Just stay close tonight." In the clubhouse's main room, Cal Britton sat on a wooden bench against the east wall and looked at the room around him. He had never been inside a motorcycle club's clubhouse before. He had seen them from the outside this building, a converted industrial space on the south end of Ridgeline, with its steel door and chapter colors above the entrance, and the parking area out front that was full on chapter nights and empty most other times. He had ridden past it on the too small bicycle more times than he could count. It had always been simply a building, a thing you rode past. From the inside, it was different. Not what he had expected, which had been something darker, more threatening. What it actually was a large room that smelled of machine oil and old leather, and the specific smell of a place where a lot of people gathered regularly, the accumulated human warmth of it, the way a room absorbs the presence of the people who spend time in it over years. There were long tables and mismatched chairs in a bar along the north wall that was not currently staffed. There were photographs on the walls, group shots, ride shots, the chapter at various points in its history, men squinting into various suns. There was a trophy case near the door that contained items Cal could not fully identify from where he was sitting. It was, he thought, more like a hall than anything else. The kind of place where people who belonged to something came to be with other people who belonged to the same something. Cutter was at the bar, back to the room, making a phone call. He had brought Cal inside with the efficiency of a man completing an assigned task, had confirmed that Cal was uninjured in any way that required immediate attention, had produced a bottle of water from somewhere and set it on the table beside the boy, and had then stepped away to make his call. He had done all of this the way that people who work in operational contexts do things, the task. Then the next task, no wasted motion. Cal drank the water. He looked at the room. He thought about the Harwick Mill building and the voices coming up through the concrete floor, and the 20 minutes of lying still and listening. And he thought about the ride down the mountain, which had been the longest 20 minutes of his life, even though the distance was not especially long. He thought about crouching in front of the big man on the mountain road and handing over the piece of notebook paper and watching the man read it without expression and then put it in his pocket like it was something he was going to take care of. He thought about the bruise on his shoulder, which ached in the dull, persistent way it had been aching for 2 days. He moved his arm slightly to test the range of motion and then stopped moving it because the range of motion produced a sensation that was not worth testing further. On the workbench along the south wall, among the various tools and equipment of a working chapter, was a radio scanner, the kind of broad-spectrum receiver that picks up local emergency frequencies, police, fire, county dispatch. Cal had one at home, a smaller unit, because scanners were something he had been interested in for 2 years, in the same way he was interested in beetles, and in the way that things with hidden frequencies interested him. His unit at home picked up the Ridgeline City Police frequency, 2 county sheriff frequencies, and the volunteer fire department. This unit was larger and more sophisticated, and it was on. Cal looked at it for a moment. Then he moved from the bench to the workbench and sat on the stool in front of it and listened. The Ridgeline City Police frequency was active. That by itself was not unusual. What was unusual was the character of the activity, not the routine dispatch traffic of a normal evening, the fender benders and noise complaints and welfare checks that constituted most of a small city department's night work. This was different. The transmissions were short, clipped, coordinated, units acknowledging assignments, units confirming positions. The traffic pattern of a deployment organized movement to a specified location, multiple units coordinated arrival. Cal listened for 4 minutes. He picked up the location reference on the third transmission, an address on the south end of Ridgeline that he knew because he had ridden past it 100 times on the Too Small bicycle. The address of the Steel Saw Chapter Clubhouse. He counted the unit acknowledgments. 8, 12, 16. The transmissions kept coming. He stopped counting at 24 because the pattern was clear enough without the precise number, and because he was already off the stool and moving toward Cutter, who was still on his phone call near the bar, with the urgency of someone who has once again found himself in possession of information that cannot wait for a convenient moment. Cutter, he said. Cutter held up a finger without turning around. Cal said his name again, not louder. With a different quality, the quality that made Cutter turn around and look at the boy's face and end his phone call in the middle of a sentence. What Cutter said. "They're coming here," Cal said. "Police. A lot of them. I heard it on the scanner." He pointed at the workbench unit. "They're coordinating right now. I counted at least 24 units, and they were still coming in when I stopped counting." Cutter looked at the boy. He looked at the scanner. He crossed to it in 4 steps and listened for 30 seconds, and his face did the thing that faces do when information confirms what someone else has already told you. Not surprise, but the particular compression of a man who has received bad news that is worse than expected, but not worse than imaginable. He looked at Cal. "North first," Cal said. 3 units, then east. The others cover the south and west approaches simultaneously. "How do you know that I heard the staging assignments?" "They called it out by compass." North team confirms first, then the others move. Cutter looked at the boy for one more second, taking the measure of the information, taking the measure of the source, doing the rapid internal calculation that people do when they need to decide how much weight to give something and how fast. Then he picked up his phone and called Garrett and said 4 words. "We have a problem." He looked at Cal while the line connected. "You did good," he said. He said it the same way Dax had said it on the Mountain Road flat without addition, the way men say things they have decided are simply true. Garrett Holt came out of his office and into the main room with the unhurried authority of a man who has been managing difficult situations for long enough that difficulty no longer changes his pace. He listened to Cal's account of what the scanner had produced, the unit count, the compass, staging the timeline implied by the coordination pattern, and he asked 2 questions. Both questions were about the scanner data, not about Cal's interpretation of it, because the interpretation was obvious and the data was what needed verification. The data held up under both questions. Garrett looked at the main room, 12 people currently inside the clubhouse, not counting Cal. Chapter members who had been at the facility for the evening, not on the road. Not enough for what was coming. He looked at the clock on the wall. "How long?" he said to Cal. Cal thought about the staging transmissions, the rhythm of the coordination, the deployment pattern he had heard. 8 minutes, he said. Maybe 10. North first. Garrett nodded once. He looked at Cutter. "Get the side door open," he said. "Have everyone in the back room. Nobody near the front windows." He looked at Cal. "You stay with me," he said. Then he picked up his phone and he called Dax. Conrad Vale was in his office on the 3rd floor of Ridgeline City Hall when Teal's position check did not come through at the scheduled interval. The office was large and deliberately appointed mahogany desk, leather chairs, the furnishings that communicate authority through material rather than through words. The painting on the east wall was a mountain landscape purchased at a charity auction 3 years ago for $4,000, recorded in the municipal expense logs under beautification. Vale had looked at it every day since and had never particularly liked it, which suggested to him that he had bought it for the right reasons rather than the wrong ones. He was 50 years old and had been mayor of Ridgeline for 8 years, and in those 8 years had done what men in his position do when ambition exceeds scruple and intelligence exceeds judgment. He had looked for leverage, found it, and used it until using it became the only mode available to him. The pension fund diversion had started as a convenience. Small amounts routed through a network of municipal contractors he had cultivated over a decade of city council work. Then larger, then systematic. $3.7 million over 6 years moved through a series of vehicles that had taken him 4 years to build and that he was confident had taken the money somewhere it would not be easily found. He had been confident. He was somewhat less confident now. The Steel Saw chapter had no formal interest in municipal finance. They had community roots, which meant information, and somewhere in the dense web of informal knowledge that a motorcycle club accumulates over 30 years in a county, a thread had started to unravel in his direction. Nothing prosecutable. But Dax Mercer had asked questions twice of people who had then asked Vale's associates, and the questions had been the kind that suggested the asker already knew part of the answer and was looking for confirmation rather than information. Questions were the first step toward answers he could not afford anyone to reach. He had made the decision 6 weeks ago. Teal had been sourced through a contractor network Vale had used for other purposes, off-book purposes, the kind that never appear in official records. The operation had been planned with more care than he had expected to need to apply, which was either a sign of his professionalism or a sign of his fear, and he had stopped distinguishing between those two things long enough ago that the distinction no longer troubled him. He looked at his phone. Teal's check-in was now 11 minutes overdue. He waited 4 more minutes. He called Teal's line. It rang through to a generic voicemail. Not Teal's voice, not a personal recording, just the automated default of a device that had not been set up with any identifier. He set his phone down on the mahogany desk and picked up his wine glass, a 2019 Napa Cabernet decanted and exactly right, and looked at the painting. He set the glass down. He pressed the intercom. "I need Captain Dredge," he said, "now." Captain Warren Dredge of the Ridgeline Police Department was a broad, deliberate man whose slowness of movement was not a reflection of his processing speed, but of someone who has learned to take up space as a form of authority. He had been on Vale's payroll informally through arrangements careful enough to survive casual inspection for 6 years, and in those 6 years had performed the variety of services that a police captain can perform for a man in Vale's position. Information management, strategic non-investigation of certain matters, the occasional deployment of departmental resources in ways that aligned with the mayor's interests rather than strictly with the departmental mandate. He arrived in Vale's office in 4 minutes with the expression of a man who already knows the direction of the news and is braced for the specifics. Vale told him what he needed. 32 units, every cooperative officer on the roster. The clubhouse on the south end, he gave the address. Fabricated charges assembled fast. Obstruction weapons violations, whatever held together well enough to establish presence for the time required. He did not tell Dredge what the time required was for. Dredge did not ask. This was the nature of their arrangement. Dredge performed the operational function and managed the departmental justification himself, and Vale provided the directive in the subsequent protection. It had worked for 6 years. Dredge had no reason to believe tonight was different. He left. Vale heard the elevator descend. He stood at the window of his office and looked out at Ridgeline. His city, the city he had run for 8 years. The city he had improved in measurable ways while also doing the other thing. The thing that was not improvement, the thing that had started as a rounding error and become a structure. And he thought about contingencies. The secondary bag was in the closet behind his desk. $140,000 in cash, 2 passports, one in his name, one in a name that was not his name, and documentation of a private airstrip booking 40 miles east at Aldrin Field, a small facility operated by a man named Seb Aldrin, who had been receiving cash payments from Vale for 3 years in exchange for the assurance that a Cessna 172 and a cleared runway would be available on request, no filing, no record. Every careful man had an exit. Vale had built his with the same methodical attention to detail that he brought to everything, which was the thing about him that had made him good at what he was supposed to be doing, and also in the end at what he was not supposed to be doing. He looked at his phone one more time. He looked at the painting. He looked at the secondary bag in the closet. He left the bag where it was. Not yet. The 32 vehicles arrived at the Steel Saw Chapter Clubhouse in the sequence Cal had predicted north, first 3 units establishing the anchor of the perimeter before the east, south, and west units moved to complete it. They came in with lights running and the bullhorn active before the perimeter was fully closed, which was Dredge's instinct about how to establish dominance early, and which was also a tactical error because it announced the perimeter before the perimeter existed, giving the people inside time to confirm what was happening and make decisions before they were fully contained. Not that containment was the actual problem. 32 vehicles and their complement of officers formed a solid perimeter around the building frontside's rear. The bullhorn announced fabricated charges in the flat authoritative voice of a man who has used bullhorns before and understands that volume is a form of argument. Agent Nora Stiles had been parked 3 blocks from the clubhouse for 40 minutes. She was 38 years old, with the patience of someone who has spent 6 weeks building a case and has learned that the last 10% of the building is always the part that requires the most waiting. She had been in Ridgeline for 42 days. She had arrived with a specific brief from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, a tip, sourced through a county pension administrator who had noticed irregularities that didn't survive arithmetic, and she had spent those 42 days following the arithmetic wherever it went. It went to Conrad Vale's office through a network of contractors and municipal accounts and offshore routing that was she had come to understand genuinely sophisticated. The kind of sophistication that took time to build and took time to dismantle and required to dismantle properly a level of evidentiary completeness that she was approximately 80% toward when the evening's events had begun to develop. She had known about the threat to the Steel Saw chapter for 3 weeks. She had been managing the tension between her knowledge of that threat and the evidentiary requirements of her case with the uncomfortable precision of someone walking a line that gets narrower as you walk it. She needed the chapter alive. She also needed more time than she had been sure she was going to have. She watched 32 police vehicles establish a perimeter around a civilian structure based on charges that she could already demonstrate were fabricated, and she sat in her car for 45 seconds, and then she got out. She identified herself to the nearest officer who referred her to Dredge. She identified herself to Dredge and told him in language that was professionally precise and contained zero courtesy beyond what the situation required, that he was establishing an unauthorized perimeter based on charges that did not meet probable cause, standards that the Steel Saw chapter was connected to an active federal investigation, and that the consequences of proceeding would be ones he would be managing for the remainder of his career. Dredge looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given authority by someone he trusts and has not yet processed that the authority has a ceiling. "You have no jurisdiction here," he said. "This is a city matter. Step back or I'll have you removed." Stiles stepped back exactly as far as she needed to and took out her phone. Inside the clubhouse in the main room with Garrett and Cutter and 11 other chapter members and one 9-year-old boy, Cal, heard the bullhorn and heard the count of vehicles Garrett was getting from the two members watching from the back windows, and felt something that was not quite fear and not quite satisfaction, but somewhere between them the sensation of having been right about something you very much wished you had been wrong about. Garrett was on the phone with Dax. Cal sat on the bench against the east wall and listened to Garrett's side of the call and thought about the night about the Harwick Mill building and the concrete floor and the decision made alone on the staircase, and about the mountain road and the man who crouched down and read the notebook paper without expression, and about the scanner and the compass staging and the 8 minutes he had called that had turned out to be 9, which was close enough. He thought about his mother, who was at the county medical center working the overnight shift and did not know where he was or what he had done this evening. He thought about the bruise on his shoulder. He thought about whether the people who had put the bruise there were the same people who were outside in 32 vehicles, and decided that they were connected even if they were not the same, in the way that things are connected when they come from the same source of wrongness in the same place. He looked at the scanner on the workbench. It was still running. He went back to the stool and sat down and listened. The deployment traffic had settled into maintenance mode units, confirming position, confirming the perimeter was sealed. And then, underneath that, a different frequency. Not city police. Something that overlapped with the county emergency band, but was not the sheriff's department, a tactical frequency, short range, the kind used for coordination between units that are too close to each other for standard dispatch to manage efficiently. He listened to it for 2 minutes. He heard enough. He went back to Garrett. "There are 2 more," Cal said. "Unmarked, parked on the service road behind the east building next door. They're not on the main frequency. They're waiting for a signal from Dredge to move to the back of this building." Garrett looked at him. He looked at Cutter. He said 3 words to the 2 members at the back windows, who moved without comment. Then Garrett Holt picked up his phone and did a thing he had done twice in 16 years as chapter president. The thing that existed for the category of situation that could not be handled by any subset of the chapter's resources and required every resource simultaneously. He activated the furnace bell. The coded signal went out on the chapter's emergency frequency and cascaded through 4 county relay points in 3 regional networks, reaching every chapter in contact range, with a message that translated in the shorthand of people who understood what the furnace bell meant, simply as "Full Muster Steel Saw Clubhouse now." The response came the way it always comes, when people connected by the bond of chosen brotherhood receive a signal from a source they trust, not slowly, not partially, but completely. The Steel Saw. Chapter itself was 61 riders. 4 affiliated chapters within the county added 240 more. 3 chapters from adjacent counties that had been monitoring the frequency committed their full muster, another 315 riders. The remainder were independence associates, men who had heard the furnace bell through informal channels and had made the individual decision without being asked that they were on the right side of this. They came from every direction. Inside the clubhouse, the sound arrived before the lights did a vibration. First, the road itself, picking up the signal from beyond the visible horizon and transmitting it upward through the building's foundation and through the floor and through the soles of everyone's shoes. Then the sound itself arriving not from one direction, but from all of them simultaneously from every access road and side street and highway ramp that fed into the blocks surrounding the clubhouse. 800 motorcycles. Cal felt it in his chest before he heard it clearly. A physical presence, not a sound exactly, or not only a sound. The way very large things make themselves known before they fully arrive through the medium of the air itself. He stood up from the bench without deciding to stand up the way you stand when something happens that is larger than the room you are standing in. The sound kept coming. It did not peak and subside. It built and it kept building, and it filled every frequency of the air inside the clubhouse walls with a resonance that was not aggressive, not a threat, not a battle cry, but simply enormous and present and undeniable. Garrett stood in the center of the main room, phone in his hand, and listened. Cutter at the window said nothing, just watched. Cal stood against the east wall with the empty water bottle still in his hand and felt the sound move through him like a tide, through something that has been waiting for the tide, and something in his chest that had been held tight since the moment he made his decision, on the staircase of the Harwick Mill building, held tight through the ride and the mountain road, and the 20 minutes alone in the clubhouse, and the scanner and the compass staging, and the bullhorn outside began slowly to release. He was not crying. His eyes were dry and his face was still. But something was releasing, and it released like a breath held a long time. And when it released, he understood for the first time with the full weight of understanding, rather than just the information of it, that the thing he had done tonight had mattered. Outside, Warren Dredge stood at the center of his perimeter, and the headlights found him from every direction. They did not stop coming. Dredge stood at the center of his perimeter and watched them fill every street his perimeter touched, and every street beyond those streets, and the streets beyond those. 800 sets of headlights at idle arranged in columns that stretched back 6 blocks to the north, 4 blocks to the east, and filled the southern and western approaches to the building completely. The columns still moving at their far ends as more riders turned corners and found their places in the formation and settled their engines to the same patient idle as the riders ahead of them. The combined frequency of 800 engines at idle was a physical thing, not loud in the way that loud is usually understood, not sharp, not percussive, but present in a way that bypassed the ear and went directly to the chest, to the place below the sternum, where the body keeps its assessments of the world. It was a sound of something very large that was not moving and had no need to move because it had already arrived everywhere it needed to be. Dredge looked at his 32 vehicles. He looked at the officers positioned around the perimeter who were looking back at him with the expression of men who have done their own arithmetic and found that the arithmetic does not favor their current position. He looked at the shadows his own men's headlights were throwing across the road's surface, long shadows pointing toward him. The geometry of people who are between a light source and a wall and have no direction to go that the light source has not already accounted for. He looked at Nora Stiles. She was standing 12 feet from him, phone at her side now, the call completed, watching him with an expression of complete professional composure that contained underneath its surface a quality he recognized after a moment as the patience of someone who has been waiting for this exact moment for a long time and is content to let it arrive at its own pace. "The FBI director has authorized my intervention in this matter," she said. Her voice was level and unhurried and precisely loud enough to carry to the nearest officers on both sides without requiring her to raise it. "Which means this scene is now under federal jurisdiction. Which means I need you to stand your people down, Captain Dredge." Dredge said nothing. "You can stand them down now," Stiles continued, "or you can explain your probable cause documentation to the federal judge who is currently being contacted for emergency review." She paused for 1 second. "The judge is not happy about the hour. I'd take the first option." Dredge looked at the headlights. He looked at the shadows. He looked at the 32 officers who were looking at him with expressions that had traveled over the past 4 minutes, from confident to uncertain, to the particular blankness of men who are waiting for someone else to make the decision that they have already individually made and are simply not authorized to act on. He thought about Conrad Vale. He thought about 6 years of arrangements and assurances and the specific architecture of understanding that had been built between them, arrangement by arrangement, assurance by assurance. He thought about what those 6 years looked like from the outside in documentation, if the person doing the documenting had been doing it for 42 days with the resources of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He lowered his hand from his holster. "Stand down," he said. The sound of 32 sidearms being placed on the road's surface simultaneously was not loud. It was the sound of a small metal object meeting asphalt multiplied by 32 in a wave that started at the nearest officers and spread outward through the perimeter in the sequence of men responding to an order they had already decided to follow before the order was given. 32 small sounds, the sound of an argument being lost. Garrett Holt came out of the clubhouse front door with his hands open and visible, not in the posture of surrender, but in the posture of a man who has nothing in his hands because he has nothing to hide, and walked through the space where the police perimeter had been to where Nora Stiles was standing. He was 53 years old and silver-haired and carried the authority of a man who has been making difficult decisions for 16 years and has come to terms with the weight of them. He looked at Stiles. "I believe you have something for me," she said. "Dax is on his way," Garrett said. "He has the phone." She nodded once. Garrett looked at the 800 motorcycles filling the streets of his city. He looked at the men in the nearest columns, some of whom he knew by name, and some of whom he had never met, all of whom had come because the furnace bell had sounded, and the furnace bell meant something that transcended individual calculation. He looked at an old woman in a folding chair on the sidewalk across the street. She had come out of her house when the sound started, as the neighbors on all sides had come out, and she was watching the columns of riders with an expression that was not fear. He walked over to her because something about her expression made him walk over to her, the way certain things make you change your direction without exactly deciding to. She reached up and took his hand when he got close enough, held it with both of hers. She said something he bent down to hear because her voice was small and the engines were not. He straightened up after a moment and looked at the middle distance in the way he always did when he was having feelings he was not going to examine in public. He stood there for a moment with her hand still in his. Then he said something back to her, and she nodded, and he walked on. Conrad Vale was in the elevator when his phone showed him that Dredge's frequency had gone dark. Not a missed call, not a delayed check-in. The frequency itself, the tactical channel he had been monitoring through a handheld unit in his suit pocket, listening to the deployment traffic, the way a man listens to weather reports when he has a flight scheduled, had simply stopped. No final transmission, no stand-down order he could hear. Just the absence of the signal that had been there and was now not there. In the way that signals go absent when the situation producing them has resolved in a direction that does not favor the person who initiated the situation. He stood in the elevator and looked at the dark frequency indicator and felt the temperature of the evening change in a way that had nothing to do with the elevator's climate control. The elevator opened on the parking garage level. He had the secondary bag over his right shoulder. He had gone back for it 11 minutes ago when Teal's fourth missed check-in had moved the probability calculation past the threshold where waiting was the rational choice. $140,000 in cash, 2 passports, the Aldrin Field booking 40 miles east where Seb Aldrin would have the Cessna fueled and the runway clear, and no record of any of it in any system that anyone with a subpoena could reach. He had built this exit with the same care he had brought to everything. 3 years of cash payments to Aldrin delivered in person, never more than $9,000 at a time, always in the context of a routine facility inspection that gave him a reason to be on the property. The second passport had cost him more than the cash payments and had come through a channel he had used once before for a different purpose and had been careful not to use a third time. Everything had been thought through. Everything had been prepared. He crossed the garage at a walk that was faster than his normal walk, but controlled not running because running in a parking garage produces sounds that carry and attract attention, and the one thing he needed for the next 4 minutes was the absence of attention. His town car was in his reserved space 40 feet from the elevator. He had the key in his hand. He was 20 feet from the car when Dax Mercer stepped out from behind the concrete support pillar to his left. Vale stopped. He looked at the man in front of him, 6'2", 190 pounds, wearing a leather cut with road captain on the back and a face that had the quality of absolute stillness. Not anger, not satisfaction, not the performed calm of someone managing their emotional state. Actual stillness. The stillness of a man who has already completed the calculation and is now simply at the end of it. Vale's mind went through its options in the rapid, unordered way that minds go through options when they understand that options are running out. He thought about the town car and the distance to it. He thought about the bag over his shoulder and what it represented, and whether it could represent something different in a different conversation with a different framing. He thought about the things he knew how to do in situations like this, and then he stopped thinking about them. Because the man standing in front of him was not a situation that those things applied to, and some part of him that had been in the business of accurate assessment for 50 years understood that immediately. "I can make this," he started. Cal Britton Dax said. Vale stopped. 9 years old, lives 2.5 blocks from Route 9, rides a bicycle that's 3 years too small for him because it's the one he has. He has a bruise on his left shoulder that someone put there. Dax walked toward him. Not fast. The walk of a man who is not in a hurry because there is nowhere for the other person to go. He rode 20 minutes on that bicycle to warn us. He lay on the floor of the Harwick Mill building for 20 minutes listening to men plan to kill 12 people, and then he wrote it down because he wanted to get it right. And then he rode to the mountain road and he stopped 12 motorcycles because it was the right thing to do, and there was no one else to do it. He stopped 2 feet from Vale. "You sent 14 men with automatic weapons to kill 12 people," he said, "because they were asking questions. Because you stole $3.7 million from the pension accounts of every retired teacher and firefighter and city worker in this county, and you needed the questions to stop before they became answers." He looked at Vale with the flat, complete attention of a man who has run the full calculation and arrived at a number that does not require further arithmetic. "You built a kill zone on a mountain road and you watched it on a satellite phone in real time." He held up Teal's phone. "I have your messages, time-stamped, sender verified to your city account, photographed and distributed before I came down here." He reached out and took the secondary bag from Vale's shoulder. Not violently, just took it the way you take something that has already been established as not belonging to the person holding it. Vale's hand went to the strap reflexively and then let go because the man taking it had already moved past the strap, and the motion of holding on would have required a commitment that Vale's remaining options could not support. "The money in here," Dax said, "is going back. Every cent." Then he hit him. Once. Precisely with the economy of a man who knows how to hit and understands that the purpose of this particular hit is not damage, but meaning the meaning of a physical fact stated in the only language that the situation has not yet been stated in. His right hand closed, traveling the distance between them in a short arc that connected with the left side of Vale's jaw at the angle that produces maximum transmission of force to the point of impact. Vale went back into the hood of the town car and sat down on the garage floor with the sudden, complete deflation of a man who has had the last supporting architecture of his position removed all at once. He sat against the front tire with his legs extended and his hands at his sides, and the expression of someone who has arrived for the first time at the actual bottom of something and is finding that the bottom is exactly as hard as the bottom of things always is. He stayed down. The garage door on the east side opened and footsteps came Nora Stiles with 2 federal agents behind her, moving with the efficiency of someone who has been building to this moment for 42 days and intends to do it correctly. She read Conrad Vale his rights in the concrete quiet of the parking garage, her voice level and unhurried, the words arriving in their statutory order with the authority of language that has been made precise by 100 years of use. Vale sat on the floor against the town car and listened to his rights being read to him and said nothing. He had the expression of a man discovering for the first time what the floor feels like when you have been operating for years at a height that made the floor theoretical. One of the agents took the secondary bag. Another produced evidence bags for the satellite phone. Stiles looked at Dax. "You'll need to come in for a statement," she said. "I know," Dax said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was professionally neutral and contained underneath the neutral a quality that was not quite satisfaction and not quite relief, but somewhere between them, the feeling of a case that has closed in the way it was supposed to close, which is rarer than the work would suggest. "The boy," she said. "He's protected," Dax said. She held his gaze. "I know, he's a witness. We'll handle it correctly." "He was protected when he got on that bicycle," Dax said. "Before any of this. Before anyone knew his name." He held her gaze. "That doesn't change." She considered this for a moment. Then she nodded the nod of a person who has understood something that was not strictly within the scope of her current professional function and has decided to understand it anyway. Behind them, one of the agents was helping Vale to his feet. Vale stood against the town car with his hands cuffed in front of him and looked at the garage around him. The concrete pillars, the fluorescent lighting. The town car he had been 20 feet from reaching with the comprehensive blankness of a man for whom the architecture of the next several years has just been determined by someone else. Dax picked up his helmet from where he had set it on the hood of the nearest vehicle. He looked at the secondary bag in the agent's hands. He looked at the satellite phone going into its evidence bag. He looked at Vale one more time, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the attention you give to something you are noting and then setting down. Then he walked back up the ramp toward the street level, where 800 engines were still idling in the Nevada night. The pension fund recovery took 6 weeks. Federal asset seizure, forensic accounting, the dismantling of the offshore transfer network that Vale had spent 4 years building, and that the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit mapped completely in 12 days, once they had the encrypted data from Teal's satellite phone and the records from the secondary bag, in the cooperation of 3 of the municipal contractors who had decided in the way that people decide things when they understand the weight of the alternative. That cooperation was the rational choice. The recovered amount was 93% complete. The remaining 7% had been in a routing layer that the offshore network had moved twice in the 48 hours before the seizure, and the second movement had placed it in a jurisdiction where recovery required a treaty process that would take 18 months. The Financial Crimes Unit lead told the county pension administrator that 93% in 6 weeks was, in her experience, an outcome that fell in the top 5% of recovery cases she had worked. The county pension administrator, a methodical woman named Harriet Oakes, who had worked in the office for 22 years, and who had been the person who first noticed the irregularities that had become the tip that had brought Stiles to Ridgeline, received this information on a Thursday morning and sat with it for a moment before responding. Then she said, "When can we distribute?" The answer was the following Tuesday. The distribution went through the standard notification system letters, account statements, the administrative machinery of a county pension office, doing what county pension offices do, unremarkable in its process and in its format. The letters arrived in mailboxes on Tuesday morning, and the account statements arrived in online portals on Tuesday morning, and the retired teachers and firefighters and maintenance workers and school custodians and city clerks and parks department employees who had been told for 2 years that their pension accounts had suffered market losses found on that Tuesday morning that the losses had been reversed. Not partially. The accounts showed the balances they should have shown with the precision of a restoration rather than a rounding, each account reflecting the amount that actuarial calculation determined it would have contained in the absence of the diversion. Some of the recipients didn't believe it at first. They looked at the statement and then looked at it again the way you look at something a second time, when the first reading produced a number that the second reading needs to confirm. Some of them called the pension office to verify. The phone lines were heavy that morning, heavier than Harriet Oakes had seen them since the year the notification system had sent duplicate statements to every account holder simultaneously. And she answered each call personally when she could, and had her two staff members answer the ones she couldn't. And the calls all had the same quality, not celebratory, not relieved exactly, but careful, the carefulness of people who have been told good news before and have learned that good news requires verification before it becomes real. One man, 71 years old, a retired firefighter named Douglas Crane, who had worked Station 4 in Ridgeline for 27 years, and who had been stretching his fixed income over the gap created by 2 years of reduced pension payments, stood in his kitchen on Tuesday morning with the notification letter in his hand and did not call the pension office and did not look at it a second time. He stood at the counter next to the window that looked out at the backyard where his wife was gardening, moving between the tomato plants in the unhurried way of someone who has decided that morning tasks are worth taking slowly, and he held the letter and read it once, and then looked out the window for a while. He did not say anything. He stayed at the window for a long time. The town square and Ridgeline had been cleaned up and the temporary stage assembled by Saturday morning, and by noon the crowd was large enough that the streets adjacent to the square were full. It was not an official event. No one had issued permits. No politicians were scheduled to speak because there were functionally no politicians available. Vail having taken 3 city council members with him in the federal sweep, and the remaining council members having adopted the public posture of people who are engaged in rapid self-examination and are not ready to present the results. It was simply the town assembling itself in the way that towns assemble when something significant has happened and people want to be together in the same place for a while without anyone telling them they should be. The Steel Saw chapter arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Not 12 bikes this time. 800 motorcycles taking up every surrounding street, the column still turning corners as the front of it reached the square. Riders dismounting and walking into the crowd with the ease of large men in leather cuts who have decided to be present for something rather than apart from it. They move through the crowd the way the crowd moved around them with the natural accommodation of people who are sharing a space and have decided for this afternoon that the space is big enough for everyone. The old woman in the folding chair was there again at the edge of the square. She reached up and took Garrett Holt's hand when he walked past her the same way she had reached up 4 nights ago outside the clubhouse. He stopped. She held his hand with both of hers and said something that he bent down to hear, and when he straightened up, he had the same expression as before, looking at the middle distance. The expression of a man who is having feelings he is not going to examine in public, but which are for the moment visible anyway. He stood there for a moment with her hand still in his. Then he said something back to her, and she nodded, and he walked on into the crowd. Dax stood at the edge of the square away from the main crowd, where the afternoon light came in at a low angle from the west and threw long shadows across the paving stones. Cal Britton was beside him. Cal was wearing new sneakers, white clean, the kind with the extra cushioning in the heel that he had looked at once through a sporting goods store window on the north end of Main Street, and then looked away from, because looking at things through windows was a habit that had always seemed more useful than pressing the question. 2 days after the night on Route 9, a chapter member named Taft had come to the house knock on the door introduction. Explanation that the chapter wanted to express its appreciation in a specific and practical way and had taken Cal to the sporting goods store and told him to pick what he wanted and not look at the prices. Cal had looked at the prices anyway because that was the kind of attention he paid to things. He had picked the second cheapest pair of sneakers in his size, which were the ones with the extra heel cushioning, because they were good sneakers and they were not the most expensive thing in the store, and that seemed like the right calibration. Taft had looked at the sneakers and then looked at Cal and then looked at the sneakers again and said, "You sure?" Cal had said, "Yes, sir." Taft had bought them and had also, without comment, bought the laces in 3 colors that Cal had spent 45 seconds examining in the accessories section without picking up, and had handed the bag to Cal at the register and said nothing further about it. The bruise on Cal's left shoulder was fading, yellow at the edges now, the body quietly completing the work of reabsorbing what had been done to it, the same patient cellular process that had been running since the night it happened, indifferent to everything else that had occurred in the days around it, simply doing what it was designed to do. The question of who had put the bruise there and what was going to happen about it was being addressed through channels that Nora Stiles was professionally aware of and had chosen for now not to interfere with. The channel was moving. It would arrive where it was going to arrive in the way that these things arrive, not quickly, but completely. Cal stood at the edge of the square and watched the crowd and the riders mixing in the afternoon light and thought about the week that had passed since Tuesday night. He had gone to school on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, and on each of those days, he had sat in his usual seat and done his usual work and said nothing about what had happened because there had seemed to be nothing to say that would fit inside the normal shape of a school day. His teacher had noticed something different about his attention, more settled somehow, as if something that had been unresolved had resolved but had not asked about it, which Cal had appreciated. His mother knew. He had told her Wednesday morning before school, sitting at the kitchen table with the care of someone who has rehearsed the account enough times to know which parts require the most care in the telling. She had listened without interrupting, which was how she listened to things that required her full attention. And when he finished, she had been quiet for a moment, and then had said, "You could have been hurt." He had said, "I know." She had looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a mother who is reckoning simultaneously with what her child did and who her child is. Then she had reached across the table and put her hand on his. Not on the shoulder with the bruise, on his hand. She had not told him he shouldn't have done it. He had noticed that she didn't say that. Now Garrett Holt appeared at the edge of the square, walking toward them from the direction of the main crowd, carrying something under his arm, a bundle folded the size of a jacket. He stopped beside Cal and set the bundle on the low stone wall that edged the square and unfolded it with the deliberate care of someone handling something that has been made with attention and deserves to be presented with the same. It was a cut. Child-sized. Properly made real leather, not the lightweight material that gets used for decorative purposes, but the same weight and grade as the cuts worn by the men standing in the streets around the square. The steel saw chapter patch on the back, the same design size correctly for the dimensions of the cut. And beneath the patch, in embroidered letters that had been put there by a chapter member's wife who did leather work and who had spent 2 evenings on this particular piece, because she had understood when it was explained to her what it was for 2 words in a script that was formal enough to be permanent and readable enough to be clear. Steel guard. Cal looked at it. He looked at Garrett. He looked at Dax. He looked back at the cut. "That's yours," Dax said, "if you want it." Cal picked it up. He held it for a moment, running his thumb along the stitching on the patch, feeling the weight of it, the real weight, the leather weight. Not a costume, but a made thing. Something that had required craft and time, and the decision to make it. He turned it over and looked at the front, at the interior, at the way the lining was finished at the seams. He put it on. It required some adjustment. The armholes were sized for a child's arms, and Cal's arms were within range, but the shoulders sat slightly large, which Garrett corrected with 2 quick adjustments to the back seam that someone who knew leather understood how to make without tools. When he was done, the cut sat correctly. Not perfectly the way things fit when they have been worn long enough to conform. Correctly the way things fit when they belong. Cal stood straight, the way you stand when something fits. "Steel guard," he said, reading it from inside his own mind, from the way you know what's written on the back of something you're wearing, because you have just put it on, and the words are still present from when you looked at them. "You earned it," Garrett said. It was not a complicated statement. It did not require elaboration. Garrett was a man who understood that the things worth saying were worth saying at the volume that required attention, and the thing he had just said was worth saying simply without addition, and so he said it simply and left it there. Cal looked out at the square, at the crowd and the riders and the afternoon light and the 800 motorcycles filling the streets of his town, and thought about the Harwick Mill building and the concrete floor and the 20 minutes of lying still and the decision made alone. He thought about the ride down the mountain, standing on the pedals, going as hard as he could go. He thought about the man who crouched at eye level and waited without impatience and read the notebook paper and put it in his pocket and said, "You did good." He thought about all the places between the beginning of that evening and this moment where things could have gone differently. The number of those places was not small. He understood this with the clarity of a 9-year-old who pays close attention to things and has spent a week understanding incrementally how many variables had been in play on Tuesday night and how many of them had landed correctly. He did not think about himself as brave. He did not think about himself as anything in particular. He thought about what the evening had required and what he had done about what the evening required, and those two things seemed to him to be more or less the same size, which was the only measurement that had ever seemed worth making. Dax stood beside him and looked at the square. He thought about 12 years of Army Rangers and 11 years of Riding Point for the Steel Saw chapter, and the various things that those combined years had required him to understand about the people who do what needs doing when what needs doing is difficult and frightening, and there is no one else to do it. He had known soldiers. He had known brothers. He had known men who were afraid and did the thing anyway, and men who were not afraid and did the thing anyway, and he had come to understand over those years that the ones who mattered were the ones who understood the difference between fear as information and fear as instruction, and had decided clearly which one they were going to listen to. He looked at the 9-year-old in the leather cut standing straight beside him. He thought about a rust-eaten bicycle in the gravel of a mountain road shoulder. He thought about a piece of notebook paper with block letters and a circled number 3. He thought about the nerve that does not come from the absence of fear, but from deciding in the full presence of it to move anyway, to get up off the floor and go down the stairs and get on the bicycle and ride toward the thing rather than away from it, because the thing needed to be ridden toward, and you were the one who was there. He picked up his helmet. Around them, 800 engines turned over. The sound rolled out across the square and through the streets of the town. Not all at once, not in a signal or a salute, but in the natural sequence of 800 individual decisions made at approximately the same moment. Engine by engine, the way things happen when a large group of people who share an understanding reach the same conclusion independently and act on it together. The sound built the way it had built outside the clubhouse 4 nights ago, not aggressively, not as a statement directed at anything or anyone, but simply as the sound of something large and present that was going to keep existing, that had kept existing through the things that had been done to try to stop it from existing, and that intended to keep existing regardless of what anyone thought about it. It filled the square. It filled the streets. It moved through the crowd, not scattering it, but moving through it, the way a tide moves through a harbor, lifting everything equally. People raising their heads without deciding to raise them, the way you raise your head when something very large passes through the air above you and the air itself moves in response. Cal tilted his head back. He let the sound come down over him, through him, the way the sound at the edge of a waterfall comes through the air and through the ground simultaneously and meets in the middle of your chest. He felt it in the new sneakers and in the leather cut on his shoulders and in the place below his sternum where the body keeps the things it knows before the mind catches up to them. He felt it in his hands, which were at his sides open, the way hands are open when there is nothing left to hold on to and nothing that needs holding. The bruise on his shoulder ached with the distant fading ache of something that was almost gone. He stood straight. Dax put on his helmet. The engines kept their sound across the square and through the town and out into the high desert evening, where the last of the light was going amber and long against the granite faces of the mountains. The mountains that had been there before the town and would be there after it, indifferent to the specific human business of justice and loss and recovery, and the particular courage of 9-year-olds on rust-eaten bicycles, indifferent to all of it, and therefore in their indifference, a kind of permanent witness to the fact that it had happened, that it had mattered, that a boy had gotten on a bicycle and ridden toward the thing, and the thing had changed because he did. The light held for another moment against the rock. Then the evening came and the engine sounded in it, and the town was lit by 800 headlights turning east toward the long road home.